Welcome everybody to today's program. We're so glad to have you here, especially Mr. Malhotra and Dr. Clooney. Thank you so much for being here today. We're really happy to have you. So today's presentation, of course, is a book presentation by Mr. Rajiv Malhotra with commentary by Dr. Francis Clooney from Harvard University. And this book presentation is about being different, an Indian challenge to Western universalism. So I'm sure you're all very excited to hear about that today. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce Mr. Rajiv Malhotra. He is the founder and president of the Infinity Foundation, which is a leading organization in the Indian community dedicated to providing an indigenous Indic perspective on many issues affecting the Indian American community today, affecting the study of India in academia and the way Indians are perceived elsewhere as well. He is a telecommunications entrepreneur and has since broadened to bring the Indic perspective to a variety of different fields. Currently, he's also chairman of the Board of Governors at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth Center for Indic Studies, so we're very proud to welcome him here for that as well. He's also been appointed to the Asian American Committee for the state of New Jersey in chairing a series of Asian education programs in schools. He's authored Being Different most recently, but also Breaking India, another seminal work in the field, as well as provided the inspiration for Invading the Sacred, a book about Hindu religious perspectives in academia. So he's a very prominent, very provocative, very controversial, and very insightful author that we are so delighted to have with us at the Center for Indic Studies today. Mr. Malhotra, we welcome you.
Thank you for inviting me here. I'm delighted to be here. And thanks to Francis Clooney for being here to give us comments. The cover of the book is a motif of a certain narrative in Hindu philosophy, the narrative called Samudra Manthan, which is churning the ocean for creative output. And there are two opposing groups churning the ocean. The front image shows one side, and the back image shows the other side, and the spindle is in the spine of the book. Now, this churning of the ocean of opposites is a sort of process I've carried out in producing this book. I've tried to discuss, debate, have conversations with numerous people from other points of view, including Catholic theologians. Francis was kind enough to give a comment on the, detailed his analysis of the whole manuscript a year ago. I sent it to Protestant theologians, Buddhists, different denominations of Hindu scholars, Western secularists, scientists, and so on, philosophers, in order to get back critical views so that I could respond, and in responding, improve the arguments in the book. So that motif is the process I've carried out. I realized that some of the ideas of what is India, what is Dharma, what is West, even what is Christianity, are not so simple terms because they are very complex. They include many views, many streams, many ideologies within them. I realize that, and I address that in the book. But still, these terms are reference points, because if you were to search any single day's news and you were to search for West, you'd see thousands of hits. People are talking about the West, whether it's Western economy, whether it's Western military, whether it's Western powers, whether it's Western thought. And you look in the catalog of a college or a university, you'll find a lot of things in the humanities about Western stuff. So the entity exists, even though it is not a simplified entity. It's a complex entity, but it exists. The premise of this book is that difference is a necessary built-in feature of the cosmos. There's differences in plants and animals and human cultures. I mean, if you look at trees, there's oak trees, one part of it, one kind of tree, and a certain kind of category within the oak would be a particular kind of oak tree, and then not every oak tree is the same as another one, and not even two leaves of the same oak tree are identical. So the differences exist in many, many levels. And the same is true of animals, it's true of cultures and geographies. So it's quite natural that civilizations have differences, and these differences are inherent. And there is nothing superior or inferior necessarily about these differences, but like an apple is different from an orange, civilizations have difference. Unfortunately, it's become a fashion to want the sameness. And a lot of resistance to this book from people who say, well, why do you want to be different? Why don't you say that we are all the same? This sameness, the desire for sameness, kind of is at the expense of what difference is to be appreciated. And I call this difference anxiety, which means the anxiety that I'm different from others. It could be difference in gender, could be difference in race, ethnicity, could be in religion, could be in whatever. So the anxiety that I'm different from others is a starting point of this book. I analyze that, and I categorize it as anxiety over difference from a superiority point of view, which says I'm kind of superior and you're not like me, and that has led historically to a lot of problems. It can also be a difference anxiety from an inferiority point of view, which says I'm inferior to you, and every time we talk about difference, I feel kind of bad about it. There's a complex, inferiority complex. So the alternative to difference anxiety is mutual respect for difference. So difference is there, but we are mutually respecting. So I'm who I am, and I'm distinct, and I want to preserve that because that's my sense of being and my sense of identity. And at the same time, I want to respect you for being different and want you to do the same. So difference with mutual respect, even difference as a celebration. That's the overall point that I'm trying to make in this book of talking about difference. So the problem has the problem that has come about, particularly in the case of Indian civilizations and Dharma civilizations, is colonization has given the West a sort of de facto status of universalism. Western language has become universal, and in the words are many meanings that are implied. The Western calendar is universal. The system of measuring time has become universal. The Western philosophy, Western sense of history, Western law. So the universalizing of the West has happened not because it happens to be a universal truth, but because of power. And Chinese have started questioning that. They've come up with the Confucian ethic as a counter to the Protestant ethic. And there's a Professor Tu Wemming at Harvard who writes a lot about it. And the Chinese government has started 100 Confucian institutes in different parts of the world to teach a Chinese alternative to Chinese worldview of things in every respect. So certainly a Confucian universalism, you might say, that is being propagated is definitely a counterexample to the Western universalism. And one might argue that Islam has a claim to universalism also, according to which the whole world, the way things are done, the way society is organized, and the family law and all kinds of things, they have an alternative view. It's not a question of what you like or dislike, it's just a question of acknowledging that this is the state of the world, these are civilizational alternatives that exist. So I've been churning on the question, is there a dharmic alternative as well? This started many years ago, more than a decade ago, when I was invited to give a talk on Huntington had just come out with his book, The Clash of Civilizations. So I was asked to comment on, where is India in the clash of civilizations? And my view was that there is an Indian point of view, but it's not a point of view that wants to necessarily impose. It is a different point of view in the sense that it is not an expansionist point of view. It is a point of view that has this difference with mutual respect built into it. And a good example is the way Sanskriti, the word Sanskriti is sort of like civilization or culture, and it's not the same thing as Sanskrit, which is a language. Sanskriti, the culture and civilization that emanated from India, spread across Asia with no army, with no kind of pressure to convert, at a time when the Chinese welcomed it, The Chinese sent their brightest students to universities in India to learn Sanskrit, bring it back. Buddhists took not only religion but art and medicine and agriculture and science and astronomy, all kinds of things with them. All over these Southeast Asian countries you'll find a huge amount of Sanskrit in their archaeology, in their language, in their sense of who they are. So it became this export of India became quite a pan-Asian civilization, with no military, no one imposing a governor, no one wanting to collect taxes. It was not done like the spread of Christianity or the spread of Islam historically. And there was no attempt to change their sense of history and language and put an Indian language on top of them and give them a new sense of who they are. So that attempt was never made. So there is an alternative role model for universalism, for globalization. This reminds me, a few years ago, I was chairing an Asian Studies Commission in New Jersey, and we were having a discussion on how to bring Asia into the curriculum. So one of the topics which they address in high school, one of the standards is to talk about spread of civilization. So I said, why don't we also include the spread of, Indian civilization and Asian civilization? And at first they all said, yeah, that's very nice, of course we should. And so the minutes showed that, yeah, we're going to do that. It was sort of just to placate or just to be politically correct. I guess they accepted it. But then when it was time for action, a lot of people started wondering, what does that really mean? I mean, they started, when the committees did some further research, they came back and said, we don't know of any examples. And they were looking for expansionist conquests. So I was asked once, who conquered Asia from India? Who conquered? Can you give examples? So it became quite a debate to explain that the spread of civilization without conquest is actually possible and an alternative model. So you don't look for armies as correlates to your claim that the civilization has spread, because it was taken in trickles. It was sort of very pulled in by the receiving side and not pushed out by the donor side. So I'm just giving that as an example of a new kind of worldview, a new kind of universalism which does not suffer from the inherent clash. Because I'm also asked, aren't you creating conflict by showing difference, by emphasizing difference? And my response is that while certain kinds of difference have conflicts built in them because of the exclusivity claim, because of the claim that it's my way and this is an edict from God or whatever the rationale might be, that need not be the case. And if there is a pluralism of worldviews, a pluralism of faiths that is built into a tradition, an open architecture as I call it in this book, then the problem of conflict is not inherent in the nature of difference. So the first point I have is that there is difference in the cosmos that's built in. The second point is civilizations are a particular case of this. Civilizations do have difference. There is no reason to deny that difference. The third point is that Western universalism is an issue because there are other claims of universalism also that need a seat at the table. Now, in this book, I introduce several terms and describe them in detail. I introduce a new vocabulary to deal with this issue of difference. One of the terms I introduce is called digestion. And by digestion, I mean one civilization getting digested into another. So the integrity of a civilization is lost when different parts of it are mapped onto Western equivalents, or what are considered to be Western equivalents. So yoga becomes Christian yoga, Vipassana becomes mindfulness meditation, and the origin of Vipassana and its Buddhist philosophy is left behind. It becomes a good healing exercise, healing methodology, but its application to go beyond just healing and relaxation to higher states of consciousness are not necessarily conveyed, because if you were to bring along the whole Vipassana philosophy, that would be a richer way of doing it. So under this metaphor of digestion, I discuss how the translation of Sanskrit words into English can be a form of digestion because the original Sanskrit idea is lost. For example, I have chapter 5 talks about non-translatables, words that are not translatable, and I give you 15 or 20 examples why Shakti cannot be translated as, energy, because it's more than just say electricity or light or something. It's a whole different philosophy built into the notion of Shakti, and why it cannot be translated as Holy Spirit also, which some people have. Why Atman cannot be translated as soul, which gurus are doing, just to make it easy for them to explain and win over Western converts. They are trying to reduce the difference and make it same, so that it looks like it's easier to bring in a large number of Western followers. But these Western followers are not as secure, as permanent, as long-term, as deeply committed as they would be if they were required to actually study what the Indian concept really means, rather than a quick substitution with a Western concept. Soul is not the same as Atman because classically souls don't reincarnate. Of course, there's a view that they do, but the mainstream view is that soul doesn't reincarnate, and certainly soul is not in animals or plants, but Atman is. So when you replace Atman with soul, you've also tampered with its richer meaning and replaced it with a simpler meaning. I also explained that Dharma is not religion. Dharma cannot be easily replaced with the word religion. It creates a lot of problems. Nor is it law. Sometimes people translate it as law. Sometimes they translate it as ethics or morality. It's a little bit of all of these, but it's actually quite a distinct and profound notion by itself. So to prevent this translation as a distortion and as a form of digestion, I recommend introducing certain Sanskrit words into the English language. Make the English language richer by introducing the original Sanskrit word, make it part of the English language. For instance, the word yoga is part of the English language, and luckily it survived as the original word because Max Miller, who translated the great works of India, many, many volumes, luckily he did not translate Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. Had he translated Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, he might have turned yoga into exercise or gymnastics or prayer or something like that, and today people wouldn't be thinking of it as something distinct. So the distinctiveness of a tradition is partly preserved in its non-translatables. There is Arabic non-translatables, there's every language, Latin and so on. So I'm not making the case for Sanskrit per se, but I'm giving Sanskrit as my example of non-translatables. The issue of digestion is also a matter of philosophical mapping. So it's not just words, but philosophy. If you map the idea of the journey of the self to a Judeo-Christian framework, then you tend to ignore either explicitly or implicitly the idea of reincarnation and replace it with one life, after that eternal heaven or hell. And you've really done away with the huge corpus of knowledge in the Indian spiritual traditions. All the Dharma traditions, Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, Sikh, they have this built-in idea of karma and reincarnation. So in this book, I have a conversation or a point of encounter between the karma reincarnation worldview on one side and the original sin, which requires virgin birth and God to take incarnation as Jesus and then sacrifice and for redemption and so on. And I show that if you assume either side as your starting point, it negates the other side. So there is an incompatibility. You cannot uphold the ideas that are sacrosanct to a lot of mainstream Christians. Not all, I agree, but a lot of mainstream Christians, known as the Nicene Creed, and recited very frequently. And in fact, on the websites of many denominations, I went and did research, the definition of their faith, their particular denomination, involves the Nicene Creed as an article of belief. So if you take the principal tenets of Nicene Creed as your starting points, then it's very difficult to accommodate karma and reincarnation, and vice versa. So I try to highlight in this book what is not possible to translate, what is in the philosophy and metaphysics that's not possible to map, because if you map either one onto the other, you do violence one way or violence the other way. So this is a much more challenging, the interfaith discourse that I am calling for is far more challenging than has been the case. I'm saying that the reason the interfaith has failed to produce results beyond just nice political statements of how we're all the same and we love each other and so on, the reason is that people have not felt comfortable addressing differences and have not wanted to just negotiate or discuss or reason how to coexist in mutual harmony despite those differences and still have mutual respect. So the kind of denial mode about differences I see as a serious problem. And so one of the recent discussions I had in India, I just came back, by the way, and had 15 events in a month or less than a month in different places in India, and I'm putting up these on YouTube, so if I get people's email addresses, I'll send you the links. And they are academic, they are corporate groups, and they are religious groups, and there are eminent thinkers that I've interviewed one-on-one. There's one individual who is a very famous Christian that has lived, is an Anglican church person who's lived in India most of his life, loves India, champions Indian culture, speaks on its behalf, famous BBC correspondent. And we have a 1.5-hour conversation in which he starts by saying, I'm not happy that you're talking so much about difference in this book. I wish we talk about how we are the same. So I said, okay, you can be same as me. Or would you like me to be same as you? There's a difference. So we go through these issues of difference. And one of the things I raise is the historicity of Jesus and the exclusivity of Jesus. It tampers and steps on the toes of the Hindu claim that there have been many incarnations. So if we are the same on the Christian terms, then it means we have to distort some ideas about our own tradition. On the other hand, when I asked him, would you be willing to accept if he said Jesus is a great incarnation, one of the greatest, but there's others? And he has a hard time. He has a hard time because he says, well, my church won't accept it. So then we move on to the next one where we talk about the nature of the self in Hinduism is called Satchitanand, which means divinity. You are a divinity. And he has a hard time with that. So he has a hard time because he can say, well, there is the divinity in me, and the divinity can come in me, but it is not that my innate nature is divine. That could be a problem. Then we talk about whether he would accept the idea of Shakti as immanence, because he says we also have the idea of immanence. The divine is immanent. And whereas in Hinduism we have the idea of Shakti as sort of the all-pervading, and it's tempting to say that they mean the same thing. So then I asked him, well, if they mean the same thing, then our deities, the images, the forms that we worship, the murtis as we call them, would you be willing to put them in the church? Would you be willing to take all the Hindu deities and put them in the church? Because if it's all divine presence, he felt that it's all Holy Spirit. If it's all Holy Spirit, then let's take it to the stage and ask and see if a church would put them all in the church and worship them. And he says, no, that will never be accepted. So I said, well, why won't it be accepted? You just said that Holy Spirit is also all pervasive. So if it's all pervasive, then these are forms of divine, and therefore you should be able to take me to any church and show me that they have no problem with them. So he says, well, then that borders on polytheism. That will border on polytheism, and it will border on idolatry. So you see, the point is, it's a very interesting 1.5-hour debate I have with this gentleman. A very open, very candid, extremely fair, extremely kind, nice person, very Hindu-friendly kind of person, and despite a strong and genuine desire to sort of not talk differences and talk about how things are the same. When we talk about specific articles, it becomes very difficult for him to accept those beyond just a sort of a very surface sameness. So I've been doing this, and I intend to use this book as a sort of starting point for many conversations to convince people that we need a different kind of interfaith where the dialogue is not based on, well, aren't we all believing in one truth and one God, and we all love each other, and we should avoid bad things and help our neighbor, and so therefore we are all same because we have certain similarities of ideas. But rather elevate the interfaith dialogue to a dialogue of differences with mutual respect. Because once you've internalized the principle that there are going to be differences, and these differences should not be turned into tension or anxiety, then people can be more relaxed. And I show in this book the idea of integral unity that is very sort of common to most dharmic worldviews, as opposed to what I call synthetic unity in the West. That this idea of integral unity lends itself to pluralism built in. So it can assimilate many, many different ideas. But the difficulty I have in discussing with people from the Abrahamic traditions is that the converse is not so easily accepted. From their side, the idea that the dharmic claim is legitimate, not tolerant, but legitimate, actually legitimate, is not so easy to accept, because it violates, at least in the mainstream institutional stand, it violates an article of exclusivity which is built into their tradition. So the book has 4 chapters on 4 different kinds of differences. That's the whole book. I've just given you the overall purpose of the book and the project of the book, but I haven't gotten into specific examples of differences. There's 4 very big categories of difference that you should take a look at in the book. Probably the most significant is what I term history centrism. I use that term history centrism to describe a view in the Abrahamic traditions, which is that the study of history is absolutely necessary in order for them to know the highest truth. And in the Indian traditions, history is nice, and in certain denominations in Vaishnavism, it is also given a huge amount of emphasis. But overall, when you look at the Dharma overall, the idea that the human being is Satchitanand, and therefore through yoga, through meditation, through various spiritual practices, one can achieve a higher states of consciousness, and one can have unity consciousness, one can actually experience what the prophets experienced or what the rishis experienced, one can actually get the first-hand, direct, first-person experience of the ultimate. That makes history less relevant, because history is just an anecdote of somebody else having that experience, which I'm also capable of having, and each of you is capable of having. So this ahistorical, what I call embodied knowing, or in Sanskrit Adhyatma Vidya, is a kind of an antithesis or antidote to history centrism, which says that man is infinitely removed from God, has no access to the Jesus experience or the Muhammad experience, and therefore must rely on their historical accounts for him to know the truth. So this I refer to as history centrism. And then I explain that history centrism has the issue with it that history centrism tends to lock you into non-negotiables. You cannot negotiate the historical elements, because if you were to, it would compromise your whole system. And the example I give is Jesus in Islam is not seen the same way as Jesus in Christianity. Jesus in Islam is a great prophet. He is one of the greatest prophets, but he's not Son of God. And there's a reason for it. Because if Jesus was seen as Son of God, Muhammad is not Son of God. He's not considered Son of God by Islam. He's a regular human being like anyone else who is just transmitting God's message. So he's a messenger, like the person who's a spokesman. So the teachings of Son of God, being God's own incarnation, cannot be superseded by statements coming out of a regular prophet. And to supersede, because prophet is more recent than Jesus, for the teachings of the Quran to supersede the teachings in the Bible, Jesus is brought down as another prophet. So a prophet can be superseded by a prophet, but Son of God cannot be superseded by a prophet. And this is an argument that Muslims will give you, that they respect Jesus, they think he's one of the greatest, he's got lots of fantastic things, and all that is fine, and they will focus on a lot of commonalities, one God and prophets and whatnot. But the idea of Jesus being Son of God is not in the Islamic codified Islamic. There'll be a few people who might, but they're not the mainstream authorities. In Islam as such, is not accepted. This means that now if you go to Christians and say, okay, they're willing to accept Jesus as a regular prophet, but not a Son of God. No virgin birth, no Son of God, this kind of thing. Is that acceptable? Christians will say, hell no, because you've tempered, you've mapped Christianity onto Islamic history centrism in order to kind of digest Jesus into Islam, but it's not acceptable. So it's one history centrism of Christianity and another history centrism of Islam, and the two cannot be reconciled in a win-win without one or the other having to be compromised a little bit. If this were not the case, then it would have been sorted out a long time ago. So another example is the Christian Zionists believe that the second coming of Christ, the end of time, all the stuff that's in the book of Revelation, is waiting for humans to restore the kingdom of Israel. And when the kingdom of Israel is restored, then all these things can happen. But the kingdom of Israel being restored involves restoring the temple of David, which is part of the kingdom of Israel. It's a very central part of the kingdom of Israel. And restoring this temple of David is not an easy thing, because today there's a mosque where the temple of David was. So, and this is not an ordinary mosque. This is the mosque from where Muhammad went to paradise. So you have a historical claim of one and a historical claim of the other, where the two are in conflict. And so one can just go on and on giving a whole lot of these examples of what happens when one comes from a history-centric tradition. The resulting exclusivity, the resulting absoluteness that emerges from the dharmic point of view, this seems to be an issue. So I bring out numerous of these kinds of differences in approach. And what I recommend is a Sanskrit is a technique in the Dharma traditions called Purva Paksha. Purva Paksha means reversing the gaze. I gaze at you and try to understand where you're coming from in a decent manner, not rhetorical, not taking pot shots, but trying to understand. Maybe my first cut won't be perfect, but I'll keep getting better and better. And my own journey in this book is a Purva Paksha of the West. So Purva Paksha means each side looks at the other and understands the other, and then tries to give a response using its own siddhanta, means its own worldview, its own theory. So the Purva Paksha tradition was very popular in the Indian classical period. Vedantins would do Purva Paksha with Buddhists, and then different schools of Vedanta would do Purva Paksha with each other and with Mimamsa. So there were all these different alternative worldviews doing Purva Paksha with each other. I consider that to be a better model for interfaith dialogue than the current model of sameness. So in the sameness model, interfaith dialogue means people are talking about how we all love each other, everything is same, there's no issues. And the alternative, which I call Purva Paksha, is that people are taking a serious look at difference from their own point of view in an atmosphere of mutual respect. So that's what the book is about. I welcome you to read it. Thank you for listening, and I would really look forward to France's comments and hope to learn from them. Thank you very much.